Hello and welcome back to Star History Blitz. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez and we're going to continue with the early republic. These are some of the key points for today's video lesson. Let's go ahead and continue with our fourth president of the United States of America, James Madison. During the early republic, America had been trying to avoid war with Britain. Even since Washington was president, he had issued the Neutrality Proclamation. And throughout every new president that we had, they tried their best to stay neutral. However, by the time James Madison is president, too many things had been happening that caused America and Congress to eventually declare war on Britain. So let's talk about what were those things that were happening? Well, first of all, Britain was blocking our naval trading ships, which was causing a disruption in trade. We were not able to commercially trade with other nations. And that was one of the things that Washington had given advice to the country in his farewell address, saying, hey, let's not make political alliances. However, let's continue our commercial trade. The second thing that's happening is that Britain is impressing our U.S. sailors. What does the word impressment or impress mean? What it means in our history terms is that Britain was kidnapping our sailors from our American ships and forcing them to work in their British ships. So that is impressment. Britain was also providing guns to the Native Americans and kind of encouraging them to use them against America. So those become the three causes for the War of 1812. This is a way, using total physical response, that we can learn the causes of the War of 1812. So I need you to do it with me. The very first cause was the disruption of trade. So if you look at that first little GIF of myself, you'll be able to see that they're blocking our trading ships. And what's that causing? A disruption in trade. The second thing that happened was the impressment of U.S. sailors. So let's assume this is our ship. They're kidnapping our sailors and forcing them to work for them. So here we have impressment of U.S. sailors. So make sure that you do that with me. And finally, the last thing they're doing, and this should be easy to remember, show me those finger guns, right? The British were giving guns to the Native Americans, encouraging them to use them. So again, let's do all three causes. Everybody do them with me. Disruption of U.S. trade. Go ahead and say it as well. So let's start again. Ready? Disruption of U.S. trade. The second one, impressment of U.S. sailors. All right. And the third one, British gave guns to the Native Americans. All right. So those are the causes of the War of 1812. Here you'll see a cause and effect graphic organizer. So again, we know that the first cause is a disruption of U.S. trade, right? They're blocking our U.S. trading ships. The second one, impressment of U.S. sailors. And the last one, the British supporting the American Indians in the Northwest Territory by giving them what? By giving them guns. All right? Causes of the War of 1812. So the battles and events of the War of 1812 include the first battle, which is the Battle of Lake Erie around the Great Lakes area. Some important events, the British did get to burn down our very first White House that we had. That's where Dolly Madison actually was able to save the very first presidential portrait of George Washington. And we actually still have it in the White House today because of Dolly Madison's bravery. During this time, this is when Francis Scott Keyes actually makes the poem that eventually becomes our Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. It showed a lot of patriotism during that time. The last battle is the Battle of New Orleans, and that's when future President Andrew Jackson becomes a famous war hero. And finally, the Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. There's no clear winner. What America and Britain basically said was like, well, what are we fighting for? And they're like, well, for you to stop disrupting our trade, impressing our US sailors. And so they basically just said, let's call it a truce and let's just end this war. And that's what they did. So what were some of the effects because of the war? Well, number one, the war proved that the nation could defend itself. Within the middle of fighting this war, we couldn't trade with Britain because we're fighting against them. So a lot of the manufactured goods we used to get from them, we couldn't get. What were we forced to do? We were forced to manufacture our own goods. So there was an increase in US manufacturing. There was also an increase in domestic economic growth, which means we started to make money. And finally, there was an increase in nationalism, which is this feeling, this patriotic feeling that we love our country. So when it comes to our TPR, our total physical response, what we're going to do is remember that everything increased. So always do this, that we remember that it went up. The first thing that increased, we had an increase in economic growth, an increase in economic growth. There was also an increase in manufacturing, so making. I don't know how else to say making, but we're going to make stuff. So an increase in industry and manufacturing, so factory system. There was finally an increase in nationalism, our love for our country. Later, this becomes known as the era of good feelings. What's our feeling? Nationalism. So here's our graphic organizer, and this is comprehensive. So it shows us our causes and our effects of the War of 1812. Let's move on to James Monroe, our fifth president. During Monroe's presidency, there is a revolution happening in Latin America. All of these colonies were controlled by European monarchies, and they fought for their independence and they won. By 1830, all of these are independent Latin American republics. We call them baby republics because they're barely starting off, right? But they're independent from their monarchies. So they're no longer controlled by these European crowns. However, because they're independent and they're baby republics, a lot of these European monarchies are looking over the Atlantic Ocean and trying to gain control again. So what happens is James Monroe, America, Uncle Sam, they step in and they say, hey, you cannot come back over here. You need to stay on your side of the hemisphere, which is the eastern side of the hemisphere. And we will stay on the western side of the hemisphere. America had this big, strong feeling, which was nationalism, right? This era of good feelings. And because we had defended ourselves, we felt proud, we felt strong, and we felt like we could protect these Latin American nations from these European countries. So what we did is James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, basically saying there will be no more European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. So here you see the European nations. Uncle Sam, which is a representation of the United States of America, has put a fence there. And now we're guarding these South American republics. We're protecting them because they're babies. They're just starting. Here's another political cartoon showing the European monarchies on the eastern side and North and South America on the western side, and we're protecting them. So that is the Monroe Doctrine, when we prohibit any European colonization on the Western Hemisphere. And finally, John Quincy Adams, our sixth president, and this will wrap up the early republic. He's the last president that falls under that time period. John Quincy Adams is the son of our second president of the United States, John Adams. In the 1824 presidential election, Andrew Jackson, our war hero during the War of 1812, ran against John Quincy Adams for president. Now, Andrew Jackson actually won the popular vote. However, because there were so many candidates running, he didn't win the majority, so 51%. So what happens is, under the 12th Amendment, what they did is they allowed Congress to decide who the winner was between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And well, Congress decided on John Quincy Adams. Now, here's a little background knowledge on Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was born a common man. He was not born wealthy. And so a lot of people think that that's the reason why Congress decided to give the presidency to John Quincy Adams. And so it became known as a corrupt bargain. And that's what John Quincy Adams' presidency is remembered for this corrupt bargain. During this time, the political party split. What used to be the Democratic Republicans now became the Democrats, the Republicans, and then you also have the Whigs. And the Whigs are basically people against Jackson, right? And Jackson represented the Democrats, the common man. Finally, another thing that happened during John Quincy Adams' presidency is a very important landmark Supreme Court case known as Gibbons versus Ogden. Basically, what this case did is that it really solidified the power of the federal government over the state governments. What it said is, at the end of the day, the federal government has more power than the state government. The case clarified the division of power between the federal government and state governments. Some steamboats were given permission by the federal government to ship through there, right, to trade through there, while some were given power or permission by the state governments. And so they were fighting with each other saying, well, the federal government gave me power. And others were saying, but the state gave me power. And so that issue led to this landmark Supreme Court case of Gibbons versus Ogden. And the argument was, well, who has the power, right? And it basically said, at the end of the day, the federal government has more power than the state government. And therefore, the federal government will control interstate commerce. The federal government is going to control or regulate that trade, okay, within the United States. That wraps up the early republic. I will see you guys on the next one, which is the Age of Jackson. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez.